I'm Catherine Kingsley.
And I'm Catherine Stern.
And this is
Contemplating Culture,
a missionary walk through a secular age. Together we journey through A Secular Age by Charles Taylor, a book looking at the history and philosophy of how the world got where it is, and the impacts of our contemporary culture for us today as missionaries.
And we're inviting you to join the conversation.
Hello and welcome to Contemplating Culture.
Hello everyone, it's been a long time.
It has. We've been on a bit of a break. We've had some various trips and health issues and things like that, but we are back and ready to tackle Chapter 2.
Yeah, that's good, but I'm wondering how many other people have a memory like mine and going, yeah, where did we finish in Chapter 1? I'm willing to take a bet we were talking about anxiety, but that's an educated guess based on the fact that we often do. Do you remember exactly where we finished?
So far we've tackled the introduction, which introduced a lot of concepts, and then Chapter 1, which was the bulwarks of belief. So it was those three kind of things that held people to faith, that society itself was bound by faith, and over time those three things kind of got dismantled. So the first one was that God alone can move the cosmos. So creation is kind of a mystery, and because of the mystery, you kind of need someone that knows how it all kind of fits together. And that kind of then we got the neutral universe. We started to study it with science and things like that, and we started to understand, it's not as much of a mystery as we thought. The second one was that God founds and sustains peoples and kingdoms. So God kind of puts the king in place and we're stable because the king's in place. And then you start to have people looking at other ways of society functioning. And then the third one, God is our defense against evil spirits. So looking at that whole area of mystery in the world, also having the supernatural element, the things that you can't see. And as people started to disenchant the world of all of its spirits, suddenly they didn't need a defense against the evil that was just in the neutral forest. That's the kind of things we looked at over our kind of those first 11 episodes. So now we're moving into Chapter 2. Chapter 2 is called The Rise of Disciplinary Society. So it's looking at the movement from that idea of the monarch, the kingdom, and all of those kinds of things, where there was a huge hierarchy, to then where now everyone is kind of moving into being educated. Everyone's kind of moving into being proper and doing things the right way. And Taylor's going to kind of take us on the journey of some of the things that kind of bring that about. So the first thing that Taylor looks at is nature. So today we're looking at interest in nature for its own sake. So the story kind of begins that all the beautiful things like nature, art, music were all kind of used to tell the story of God, more or less. That or we look at the most beautiful works of music were all, the Mass of this, or the Michelangelo's work in the Sistine Chapel, or the Statue of David.
Rembrandt's Prodigal Son, like Bible stories pretty much, or opening up something of the mystery of faith through art.
Yeah. And then it's not a particular moment, but a series of moments in a series of different fields. So across all these different fields, science, art, ethics, music, there's these movements of starting to explore them as a science in themselves, starting to look at the thing for itself. And so the first one Taylor wants us to look at is nature, looking at nature just as itself rather than something that is like, how did we go from everything in nature pointing us to God, the Psalms and all that kind of movement, or even, we know a lot of the saints will do this, they'll, go for a walk through the fields and everything is speaking to them of God. How do we go from that to studying nature for itself, to, he calls it the autonomization of nature, where nature starts to exist by itself, separate from the field of God.
So like a tree, instead of looking at it and thinking Garden of Eden, the fall, the cross, and a whole lot of that is what it's suggesting to me. I'm looking at the tree and I just see a tree. Is that what you're saying?
Well, he starts a little bit before that, and the example he uses is bread. So he says, at one point, there's kind of two stances of looking at bread. one party would look at bread and see all the references back through scripture to bread. So I see bread and it reminds me of the Last Supper, which reminds me of God's providence, which reminds me of the manna in the desert. So there's all of this significance. The bread isn't just bread, it's imbued with this significance. And then the second party that kind of comes along, a new kind of movement, starts to look at bread from the bread point of view of, this is art, this is science, this is culinary genius, and this should lead us back to God. Isn't it amazing that God made it possible for us to make bread? And isn't bread in itself and how it rises, isn't that amazing? And so both of them are leading back to God at this point. But along the way, this kind of movement then develops, I guess is what he would say. And it starts us to then question, well, what is bread, right? What is nature? So all of these things that started in the Stoics, so in Aristotle, looking at form and what is this thing, like 1,000 years earlier or whatever, then starts to get taken up by the new Stoics. So a new movement of ethics and philosophy and looking at things, which started in a very niche kind of way, looking at what is this thing, let's study it, to then that kind of seems to spread and take on a wider sphere.
So like basically ideas, starting with like a philosopher or a group of philosophers, become generalized. They kind of leak out and form the way a whole society thinks.
That's it. And so we're going to be really looking at that across a number of different disciplines over the coming weeks. And so today we're looking at how it kind of happens with nature. And so he says that we end up with this looking at nature for its own sake, being interested in nature for its own sake, from two paths. So the first one is, looking at the cosmos and how ordered it is, how beautiful it is, and saying like, this is part of God's perfect creation. And the other one, kind of in the movement from looking of Jesus as the eternal judge sitting out there, looking at the human Jesus. And we see it starts to happen in art as well, that we start to get, the more realism happening, a deeper appreciation of Jesus who comes to be among us, then starts to impact how people related with nature of like, oh, Jesus has come into this world. Let's look at this world. Let's look at what it is that he's come to bless. And so the beginning point then becomes nature as opposed to God. And this is all happening over hundreds of years kind of thing. And it's not like a very nice, neat, straight path. But these kind of things are happening side by side, until it gets to a point where it starts to take a little bit of root and suddenly people are looking at things, particularly nature, for itself. And so if we take the tree, for example, you could be looking at the tree saying, oh, this tree is part of God's creation and it's good, right? That very Genesis kind of idea of God made it and it's good. There's no more to be said about it. And that's called intrinsic purpose. So it has its purpose and its value is in the fact that it's created by God. To then a shift to effective purpose, which is, look at this tree. God was so good that he gave us something that can become timber, that can give us oxygen, that we can use for shade, that we can put swing sets in, that we start to see what the tree is useful for. And it's good because of all the ways we can use it. And it's really not that much of a step then if we start to treat nature like this, to start to treat all things like this, and then eventually even people. Because if we start to see, well, that's why the tree's good, then it starts to be this movement of like, oh, I must be good because of what I can do. And that's kind of where we're going today, to talking about this shift into effective purpose.
It's quite a fascinating swing, isn't it? Because what seems to be this just shift in terms of a philosophical viewpoint, like seeing something for its significance, its meaning, what it suggests to me about God, to seeing it in itself and seeing that tree or that piece of bread or whatever, and, being grateful to God for the gift of bread or the beauty of the tree, for that order of his creation. Like, it seems to be, a natural balancing up maybe of how we look at the world. But it's funny how, in the natural balancing up in human history, we seem to never be able to just stay in the middle, but we just keep following a natural progression of this sort of a pendulum swing almost, is what I'm hearing. That we don't just stop in the middle and be able to appreciate both, but we keep following this second path down to suddenly we're looking at things more for their purpose than anything else.
And that's it. It's like exactly that pendulum swing, because we had the Stoics with Aristotle, and then we have that swing of the gospel and the looking at creation through the Christian lens back to the Neo-Stoics, who are still Christian. They're not trying to separate at this point, but it's funny how then that happens. That's the way it's taken hold of. And so what Taylor kind of brings to us then is this shift in, we've started to question what nature is, questioning who God is and how we get to know God, and particularly God's will. And he says there's a shift in this time from seers to agents. So seers being the ones who kind of like look up into the stars and can see the movement and the alignment, maybe not in the physical stars, but that very much looking into the world and looking at the way that things are unfolding and trying to find God's will in that. So God's will is there, and I've just got to find it. I've got to find the right signs that he's left, the right messages that he's left in creation for me, in the world, for me to understand his will. Maybe it's not intrinsically there. Maybe I have to find it, because I'm now not just by myself. I now have purpose and value that I have to set out and find what I'm useful for, right? If we're taking that approach, my value isn't just sitting there. I need to find my value, which means I need to work out my value. So I become an agent of my own value. I become an agent of God's will. So I now have to do things, and in the doing, I figure out what God's will is. And so if we take that example of the tree again, the tree is whatever we can use it for, and we can keep finding new uses for trees. The same thing would then transfer into how we view the human person. The human person, the value, the purpose is whatever we can use the person for.
Wow. And you can really see how that pendulum is kept swinging into today, really, isn't it? We see our own value largely as a society or as individuals in what we do. You know, what do you do is a pretty standard question that you would ask someone in the meeting of them, or, you know, small talk. Oh, what have you been up to recently? It's all about doing. And even like in my experience as a spiritual director or as vocations director, the amount of time we spend getting caught up in what should I do, this whole viewing of God and the world around, well, God put me on earth to do something, my purpose, like, there's a balanced idea of kind of agency somewhere in that God allows us to enter into his work. But I feel almost like there's this something coming out of this utilitarian view of ourselves that my only value is in what I do. And there's this almost anxiety about, I have to discover what my purpose is, what God's will is for me. And if I don't, then somehow I'm going to miss out in life, or I'm going to have wasted my life, or
I'm going to let someone down.
Yeah. And it's a great source of anxiety in people.
And the thing is, we don't want our response to be another. The temptation, I guess, in me is for the pendulum swing the other way, right? To just double down on, I'm not meant to do anything kind of thing. Like, God doesn't want us to be lazy. And that's not, I think, the learning from this, but it's to just get a sense that, yeah, we can bring in, I guess, a bit more balance. And in our formation in Canberra, we used to go into this government housing area, and that exact question, what do you do, or what have you been up to? What have you been doing today? Any of those kind of questions that would be the easy thing to rest on in a party or a regular social setting, I came to learn very quickly just didn't work in that environment, because you're dealing with people who are really low socioeconomic, probably have done nothing with their day, haven't had a job in 15, 20 years. There's nothing exciting about the doing in their life. And it was very challenging for me to learn how to engage with people separate to their doing. How to just be with people, how to have a conversation that didn't revolve around what I was doing or what they were doing. It was like a whole new way of relating with the human person, but it was like I've always remembered it, and I find it so challenging now. It still sits with me when I go to a party or something like that. The instinct is it's very natural to go like, oh, what do you do? But I find that I never want to ask that question. I want to say, like, get to know the person beyond what they do. And it's a whole new skill set that like has been developing for me, I guess, over the last 9-10 years or something like that. But I've just found it, yeah, it's like discovering a whole new world. And I can understand, I guess, just as an idea, it's so interesting. But then when you apply it into practice, it's like, oh, it's actually really difficult because our whole society is pushed towards this. What do you do? What are you useful for? And if you're not doing something, it feels like you're wasting time, or exactly like what you were saying.
And you find the same dynamic at work. I don't know, or you might have as well, like doing hospital visitation or that sort of thing, where people whose whole life was defined by their doing suddenly can't do anymore. And a lot of the pastoral kind of importance of being there is almost witnessing to their value despite the doing.
Yeah.
Or the inability to do, that you have an intrinsic worth that's over and above whether or not you do and what you can or can't do.
And you know what? Even as part of my pastoral time in the hospital is spent on the respiratory ward. And so often you've got people on ventilators or people who are struggling, like their lung transplants are failing and they can't actually use their breath to speak. They're using their breath to breathe, to survive. And having to like mentally tell myself of like, just because they can't have a conversation doesn't mean they're not worth your pastoral visit. But what does a pastoral visit look like when you can't have a conversation? And yeah, just sitting with someone for like 20 minutes when you don't want to necessarily be talking, because that's energy for them as well. But there's something about presence, and there's something about the value of that person who can't even speak, who, you know, might be dying in a week, can't offer you anything. And there's not really much I can offer them either, but there's something mutually exchanged in the moment of giving. And I think that this is the thing that Taylor would say has kind of been lost during this process with nature. And it's, I guess, how we rebalance the utilitarian kind of thing is just spending time in nature, not thinking, what can I use this time for? What can I use this object for? What can I use this thing for? But just to soak in and reclaim that this thing, this sunset, this tree, isn't it just amazing? And then let it, you know, point us back up to God. One of the things that it kind of makes me think about is, I think it was maybe 2 years ago, I was on retreat and I had this burning desire to, you know, like find God's will and purpose for kind of what was next, you know? And I kind of just felt like God was saying, your existence, that was my will, you know, like your creation, and you just being you, that's the will that I have. Like, use your agency not to find my will out there, but just to discover who you are. And when you discover who you are and you just are that person, that's my will. And there was just this amazing amount of freedom that has stayed with me ever since of, I don't know, like the burden of having to pursue something other has just like dropped. But I imagine it's something that you come across all the time in your work as well as a spiritual director.
Yeah, and as vocations director, it's this inner angst about I need to find out God's will for me and do the right thing. As if there's disaster going to happen, or I'm going to let someone down or something if I don't find it and do it, or I'm going to ruin my own life. And I think the realization, the freeing realization that it's like God's will is not about what I do, it's about who I am. It's about that I am. It's really hard to help people to like almost wind backwards into that, because our society is so directed around doing, and in some ways doing is easier than being. There's almost a confusion in the being thing, I think. I often like to talk about it in terms of we want a recipe. It's like we think that there's this perfect recipe somewhere that God's being a really annoying and not dropping out of the sky. But if I follow that recipe that God's made for me in particular, and I do, step after step, then I'll get to, and I won't miss anything, and I'll be the person that God wants me to be.
As you're sharing that, I just had this image of like Guitar Hero. I don't know if you've ever played, but it's where the kind of where you've got a hit comes up on the screen and you've got to try to hit it at the exact right moment. And if you get the exact right moment, then you get points for that kind of thing. It kind of feels like sometimes it's a bit like that. Like I've got to find where the beats are and I've got to make sure I hit the beat at the right time and that I'm somehow judged how well I did aligning up with the external thing.
It's excruciating, isn't it? No wonder people like get all anxious and like discernment and God's will is this big, horrible, hard thing or this sort of ideal that you never seem to reach. But I think the most freeing thing for me was a bit like your retreat experience, and then years of having to speak about it to other people helped me refine it, was realizing that God's not like our whole being as human beings is not about doing it all. It's about being in relationship with him, that it's not about a recipe, it's about a relationship. And that like God so passionately wants to be part of our lives that if he handed us a recipe card and we walked away to fulfill the recipe, it would be at complete cross purposes to his desire. So God's like almost tragic in his loving of us, in really, you could say like withholding information in order that we have to come find him. God's kind of going, what I actually want from you is relationship with you. I want you to be with me. So I'm not going to give you so much information that you can wander too far because I want you to keep coming back. Because ultimately, I just want to hang out with you. And that really, that was the freeing thing for me of realizing that as long as I'm in relationship with him, walking with him, close to him, I'm not going to miss the important stuff because that is the important thing.
It's revolutionary, isn't it?
Absolutely. Or the other thing I was thinking was, I was remembering the constant experience of, say, our vocations weekends, where like there is something really fulfilling and like joy producing about sharing your vocation testimony, about sharing the gift of our life. And it's something about looking back at what God has done. And it's very much a story of what God has done, not what I have done or should do. And rejoicing in that sense of, I'm going to say specialness almost, of this is what God has done in me, for me. So that there's that sense of relational, God chose me, God knows me, that sort of thing. But it's a marveling at the wonder of God's purpose. It's a looking back at how he has got me from here to here, if that makes sense. And there is such a beauty in listening to somebody, but also in the experience of telling my story. And it doesn't have to be my vocation story, but my story of where God's been in my life. And it's something that affirms my significance above and beyond what I do. But it's about my significance in relation to God and what he's doing. And there's something, I don't know, the balancing up of that past experience of the seer, if you like, seeing what God's doing and seeing the significance of the world through what God has done and put there. But also the agency thing, like in my vocation story or in my whatever story, I have to choose to respond. I have to choose to recognize and move with where God is taking me. He's not just like pushing me around or pulling strings like I'm a puppet. This is a partnership I've been invited into. And part of the wonder is that God wants to be partners with me in this story. So yeah, another way I think of kind of moving against or balancing up in this utilitarian world is the stopping and looking at what's my story of grace, what's my testimony, where can I see God moving in my life and helping me to achieve, yes, my purpose, but less my purpose in doing and more in like the fullness of who I'm meant to be in a being kind of way.
Yeah. It's, I just was having a memory as you were talking, Kat, because one of the things since our last episode was recorded last year is that I took my final vows at the start of this year. So I've had this, and it was really a time for me of looking back over, and I knew that I'd have a chance to say something, you know, to the people that had come to celebrate this wonder. And I was thinking, like, if I could say anything to these people, like, what could it be? And it was really a looking back over the miracle of what God had done in my life, that he had taken me, ordinary me, who wasn't that interested in people, who was, you know, so shy, so self-enclosed, so many things, like such a homebody, so many reasons why logically it didn't make sense that I would be an MGL sister. But the miracle of God kind of, choosing, calling me, working it out in my life, but then also, like you said, that the choice was always with me to respond to what I was seeing in what he was doing. And I think exactly as you were saying, the gift for me was being able to share what God had done, that it's so cool. And I just think that there's a real power in that, for me to be able to look over my life and see it as not about me, but see it as about the goodness of God. And then it kind of just takes the pressure off, as you were saying, it takes the pressure off the future. It takes the pressure off the present, because I can just delight in knowing that God is bigger than all of this moment, that God's holding it, that I'm held in something really beautiful and sacred and precious. And I have a choice. There's always choice, but there's joy found in being able to see that it's not all on me.
Absolutely. And I'm thinking, like, this is actually some of the understanding, I think, of why, like in Evangelii Nuntiandi, Paul VI talks about people in this day, in this age, are more likely to respond to a witness than to a teacher. That there's something of the balancing in the mindset of our world where the witness, my testimony, my story of this is what's happened to me, whether they realize it or not, is speaking into hearts that need to hear something of the value of who they are, for who they are, that God is interested in them for themselves alone.
And isn't it amazing that the gift that God gave us is the Eucharist, is this gift of remembering. And maybe that's the gift that he has for us today, to spend some time remembering the goodness of what he's done. And as you were saying, to find a place, a person, a situation in your life where you can witness to the goodness of what God's done, been doing, so that, you can just enjoy being God's.
Yeah, I'm thinking, even for yourself to start with, there's a book I really love recommending on gratitude. And the author Anne Voskamp talks about unwrapping love, like this idea that stopping and being grateful and noticing what God has done is like unwrapping that gift that you've received, but you really receive it when you unwrap it.
Yeah. And
in a sense, that stopping and noticing and naming it for ourselves and allowing the joy of God's presence and action in our lives to fill us is an unwrapping of it. I guess then the sharing of it is multiplying that gift, isn't it?
It's good. And it's good to be back. All right. So there's the offering for you today is to spend some time unwrapping the gift of God's love in your past, in your story, in your day, and multiplying that gift by finding a place to witness to the gift of it. So we pray that you're well, that you're traveling well, and continue the conversation.
Talk soon.
This has been Contemplating Culture, a podcast produced by the Missionaries of God's Love Sisters. For more information from today's episode, be sure to check out the show notes. We pray that today has blessed you, and most importantly, we invite you to continue the conversation.